Hey folks, okay, Sin in Space Chapter 7, there's a couple mentions of miscarriage in it, so please be careful if that's a trigger for you. Please enjoy. Sin in Space Chapter 7. Hank Radcliffe shook Tony awake a little before dawn. "I got the stuff, Doc," he grinned. "Just came in on foot from Pitco. The half-track broke down 20 miles out of Mars Machine on the way back, and I bummed a ride on a Pitco plane headed this way. The half-track's still at Rolling Mills, and—" The doctor shook his head groggily and thought of giving Hank hell for the abrupt awakening. But it was hard to stay mad at him, and Tony would have been roused by his alarm clock for the lab check in a quarter hour anyway. Did the lab check matter? Did the medication for Joan matter? No. They were all heading back for Earth before long. "Make me some coffee," he growled. 1 minute by the clock. He stretched, rolled out, shucked his pajama tops, and gave himself a sponge bath with a cup of water that would mean one less cup of coffee for him today. Some mornings he just couldn't stand to feel or stink of methyl alcohol. Shivering, he gulped the coffee and pulled on pants, parka, and sand boots. "Let's see the stuff," he said. "Did Benaway give you a letter or note for me?" "Oh, sure, almost forgot." Hank handed over an ampule and an onion skin. The note from the Mars Machine Tool physician said, "Dear Hellman, here's the T-743 Kelsey requested by radio message. Already your note by messenger. Sorry to tell you, symptoms completely unfamiliar to me. Sounds like one of the cases any company doc would ship back to Earth as soon as possible. The T-743 has worked wonders in heat burns here, and I've seen no side reactions. Please let me know how it comes out. In haste, A. Benaway, M.D." Tony grunted and beckoned Hank after him as he picked up his physician's bag and went out into the bitter morning cold. They stopped at the Radcliffe shack, and Tony filled a needle with the new Kelsey drug. "Here's the new stuff, Joan," he said. "Ready?" She smiled weakly and nodded. He shot the stuff into her arm and said, "Here's your reward for not yelling." Hank stepped forward, switching on a light in her eyes that did Tony's heart good. Breakfast was fried green Mars beans and coffee. Bearable, perhaps, under ideal conditions, but completely inedible in the gloomy atmosphere around the big table this morning. Tony gulped down the hot liquid and determinedly pushed away his beans, ignoring the pointed looks of more righteous colonists who cleaned their plates stubbornly under any circumstances. The lab radiation checked out okay. No trouble there, at least this morning. After a meticulous cleanup, he visited Nick Cantrella in the hole-in-the-wall office at the back of the lab. "How's it look, now you've had a night's sleep on it?" Nick demanded. "You still want to throw in the sponge? Or are you beginning to see that we can lick this damn planet if only we try?" "I can't see it," Tony admitted. Soberly, he told the other man about his visit to the Tollers. "Look at old man Leroyd," the doctor added. "He can't be much past 60, and that's stretching it. I know he came here when he was 21, at least that's what he says. So how old can he be? But I gave that man a physical checkup a few months back, and Nick, he not only looks like an ill-preserved octogenarian, but if I didn't know otherwise, I'd stake my medical reputation on his being close to 90. Nick whistled. "As bad as that?" "What do you expect? Chronic vitamin deficiencies, mineral deficiencies, not enough water, never-ending fatigue from never-ending work. You pay high for trying to live off the country. More than it's worth." Half to himself, Nick said, 6 months. We lose our commercial contracts. We pay forfeits that eat up our cash reserve. What if we just go to the buyers and tell them what happened?" Tony started to answer, but Nick answered himself. "It won't work. They won't dare place another order with us because they'd be afraid it'd just happen all over again, and we haven't got the funds to sweat it out until they forget. Tony, we're washed up. There's still a search. Hell, you know none of our people took the stuff. Let's have a council meeting. I want a search." Nick, Tony, Gracie, and Mimi Jonathan held one of their irregular conclaves in the doctor's hut. Gracie was fiercely opposed to a shakedown check of the homes and belongings of the colonists, swearing that it was a frame-up by Brenner and Bell. The other three outvoted him, loathing to invade the pitifully small area of privacy left to Sun Lake people, but not daring to leave a possibility uninvestigated. "I suppose," grunted Gracie, "that when you find there isn't any Marcane in our trunks, you'll tear the lab apart looking for it." "If we have to, we may," said Tony, poker-faced, but sickened at the memory of what isolation from the life-giving flow of materials from Earth had done to the Tollers. "I've had some nasty jobs before this." He thought of how he'd lanced the swollen ego of Mrs. Bales, the neurotic, and how she must hate him for it. An ugly thought. By mid-morning, Mimi had the shakedown underway. Tony settled himself in the radio shack, firing message after message to Commission headquarters at Marsport, trying to get through to Lieutenant Neely. The operator at Pitco, who relayed from Marsport, telefaxed the same reply to the first 4 messages. Unavailable, will relay message, end. Corporal Morrison, Commission Message Center. On the 5th try, Neely still had not been reached, but Bell had. This time the reply was, Lieutenant Neely, unavailable, my orders. Under no circumstances, ground tracing device M27 lent for private use. Reminder, limited Mars message facilities taxed your frivolous requests. Requires cease immediately, end. Hamilton Bell, Commissioner, PAC. Gladys Poriski, the operator on duty, piped indignantly. He can't do that, can he, Dr. Tony? The Relay League's a private arrangement between the colonies, isn't it? Tony shrugged helplessly, knowing that Gladys was right and that Bell's petulant arrogance was a long stretch of his administrative powers, but due process was far away on Earth for those who had the time and taste for litigation and the cash reserves to stick it out. Gracie joined him in the hut long enough to say bitterly, Come and see the loot we accumulated. Tony went out to stare unhappily at the petty contraband turned up by the humiliating search. Some comic books smuggled in from Marsport, heaven knew how, by a couple of youngsters. Some dirty pictures in the trunk of a young unmarried chemist. An unauthorized .32 pistol in the mattress of a notably nervous woman colonist. A few bottles and boxes of patent medicine on which the doctor frowned. A minute quantity of real Earthside coffee, kept to be brewed and drunk in selfish solitude. By mid-afternoon this much was certain. Any Marcane hidden in the colony was not in a private home. The lab would have to be searched next. It was like going into a new world, to escape from the doomed, determined optimism of the search squad and council members back to the cheerful radiance that inhabited a hospital. Tony stood in the doorway, studying the family grouped across the room, father and mother thoroughly absorbed in each other and in the tiny occupant of the white-painted wicker basket that served as hospital bassinet. It was still hard to believe the delivery had gone so well. Tony wondered again, as he had so often in the preceding months, what could have gone wrong with all the previous attempts before they came to Mars. There had been frequent conceptions, 6 known miscarriages, and an unknown number of first-month failures. A series of experts back on Earth had searched for the reason and confessed failure. There was nothing wrong with Polly organically, and microscopic examinations failed to show any deficiency in her or in Jim. With that history, Tony had been prepared right up to the last minute for trouble that never materialized. It was still hard to believe that their success, his and Polly's, could have been so easily achieved. He's awake again. Polly hadn't quite made up her mind whether to be proud or worried. He slept for a little while after you left, she explained. But then he started crying and woke himself up. You should have seen how mad he was. His face was so red. He's quiet enough now. Tony went over and stared down thoughtfully at the small circle of face, half obscured by the oxygen mask. Certainly there was no sign of ill health. The baby was a glowing pink color, and his still wrinkled limbs were flailing the air with astonishing energy. But a newborn baby should sleep. This one shouldn't be awake so much. It's possible he's hungry, the doctor decided. Hasn't he cried at all since he woke up? Oh, a little every now and again, but if you turn him over, he stops. Tony went over and scrubbed his hands in the alcoholic basin, then came back and surveyed the baby again. I think we'll try feeding, he decided. I've been waiting for him to yell for it, but let's see. Maybe that's what he wants. The baby nuzzled against her for a moment, then spluttered furiously, turning a rich crimson that spewed back a mouthful of thin fluid. Hastily, Dr. Tony removed the infant, patted, and held him until the choking fit stopped, and restored him to his basket. Polly and Jim were both talking at once. Hold on, said the doctor. It's not the end of the world. Lots of babies don't know how to feed properly at first. He'll probably learn by the time your milk comes. Anyhow, he'll learn when he needs it. Babies don't stay hungry. It's like the oxy mask. He breathes through his nose instead of his mouth because the air is better. We don't have to cover up his mouth to make him do it. When he needs some food, he'll learn what his mouth is for. Fast. But, Doc, are you sure there's nothing wrong with him? Are you sure? Jim, in my business, I'm never sure of anything, Tony said mildly. Only I've never yet seen a baby that didn't find some way to eat when it wanted food. If your pride and joy won't take the breast, we'll get Anna to whip up some bottles for him. It's as simple as that. Or not so simple. George and Harriet Bergen's 8-month-old Loretta, conceived on Earth but born at Sun Lake, was still feeding from the breast. Loretta would be weaned not to milk, but to the standard colony diet plus vitamin concentrates when the time came. It was what the older children ate. They'd forgotten what milk tasted like. There were milch goats, of course, and someday there would be milk for everybody in the colony to drink. But to make that possible, it was necessary now to allocate all the milk produced by the herd to the nourishment of more goats to build up the stock. It was hard enough to keep the herd growing even with the best of care. Yaks, at first, had seemed like a better bet for the acclimatization to the Martian atmosphere, but they were too big to ship full-grown, and so far no young animals had survived the trip. So the colony had brought over 3 pairs of tough kids and bred them as rapidly as possible. Half the newborn kids still died, but the surviving half needed every bit of milk there was. Still, if necessary, a kid would have to be sacrificed, and the milk diverted to the baby. "Guess it's time to get you folks out of here," he told the Candros. "The place is too cluttered up. I might need this space for someone who's sick." Polly smiled up at him from the chair where she'd been sitting for the last hour. "I don't know what I can wear," she worried happily. "The things I came in would fall right off me, and I can't very well go out this way. Jim, you better—" "Jim," Tony interrupted, "you better get some sense into that wife of yours. You'll go just the way you are," he told Polly. While Jim helped her with her sand boots and parka, Tony wrapped the baby for his first trip outdoors. When they opened the front door, they were confronted by a crowd of familiar faces. It seemed as if all of Sun Lake City Colony's 11 dozen residents had crowded into the street in front of the doctor's house. "I suppose you all want to see the baby? All right," Tony told them. "But remember, he's still too young for much social life. I don't want you to crowd around. If you all spread out down the street from here to the Kendros place, everybody can get a look." Together, Tony and Jim eased Polly into the rubber-tired hand truck that did double duty as a hospital stretcher. They placed the baby in her arms and adjusted the small portable tank for the oxymask at her feet. Then they started slowly down the long curved street, stopping every few yards along the way for someone who wanted to shake Jim's hand, pat Polly on the shoulder, and peer curiously at the few square inches of the baby's face that were exposed to the weather. The doctor fretted at the continual delays. He didn't want Polly or the baby to stay out too long. But after the first few times, he found he could speed things up by saying meaningfully, "Let's let them get home now." As the small party progressed down the street, they collected a trailing crowd. Everyone was determined to be in on the big surprise. Polly and Jim didn't let them down either. The moment of dazed surprise when they saw the still wet walls of the new room jutting out from their house was all that could be asked. Equally satisfying were the expressions on their faces when they opened their door and looked in at the array of gifts. Some of the new plastic furniture was not in evidence. It was still curing in the electronic furnace. But the crib was finished, and it stood in the center of the room, its gleaming, transparent sides proudly displaying the blankets and baby clothes, diapers, sheets, and towels piled up inside. On the table, jars and dishes stood side by side with new plastic safety pins and an assortment, somewhat premature, of baby toys. Tony gave them time to take it all in, then insisted that the door be closed and Polly and the baby be allowed to settle down. While he was unwrapping the baby, he heard them in whispered consultation, and a moment later the door opened again. Jim left it very slightly ajar behind him as he stepped out, so they could hear what went on. "Wait a minute, folks," Tony heard him call. A slight hesitation and then Jim's voice again. "Polly and I, well, we want to thank you, and I don't know just how to go about it. I really can't say I'm surprised, because it's exactly the kind of thing a man might know you folks would do. I guess you all know how long we've been waiting for this kid. Maybe it's silly, but we figured it's something about Mars that made it work, or something about the colony. And now the baby's here, I hope none of you will mind, but we'd like to name him Sun Lake City Colony Candro." Jim stopped abruptly, and for a too long moment there was only the grim silence of the crowd, the same bitter thought in every mind. Then he went on. "Maybe you folks think that's not a very good idea right now. I don't know. If you don't like it, we won't do it. But the way we feel, Polly and me, well, we know things look bad now, but they're going to have an awful hard time, the Planetary Affairs Commission or anybody else, getting us off Mars." "You're damn well right, Jim," shouted Nick Cantrella. He faced the crowd with his fists hanging alertly. "Anybody think the kid shouldn't be called Sun Lake City Colony Candro?" The harsh silence broke in a roar of confidence that lifted Tony's chin. even though he knew there was no justification for it.